There are few records, no official reports, and yet it lives vividly in oral memory, in letters, and in the quiet testimonies of women who lived through that era. Their joy was not political, nor ideological. It was elemental. It was the rediscovery of the self after years of silence. In this story, each chapter captures a stage of that rediscovery. The captive silence sets the tone, the eerie stillness of life behind barbed wire, where time stands still. Whispers of the Americans introduces the first tremors of change, the rumors of kindness from those once called the enemy. The gift of a bottle marks the moment when the mundane becomes miraculous, when a simple act of generosity breaks through the walls of alienation. The dance of suds and laughter celebrates the eruption of joy, the laughter that spills from brokenness like sunlight through glass. Reflections in the mirror contemplates the fragile process of seeing oneself again, while the scent of tomorrow carries the story beyond the wire, into a future scented not with fear, but with hope. Each chapter, while fictionalized, reflects an emotional truth, that recovery, in the wake of devastation, begins not with great declarations or treaties, but with small acts of tenderness. The war ended with signatures and ceremonies, but healing began in the quiet places, in a washroom filled with steam and laughter, in a cracked mirror reflecting tired but smiling faces, in a scent that whispered of freedom. This story is not meant to glorify or excuse, nor to weigh the scales of guilt and innocence. It is instead an ode to endurance, to the human capacity to find grace in the ashes. The German women in this tale are not saints nor villains. They are simply human beings, caught between histories, yearning for something as simple as a reason to smile. And in that yearning, they become universal. Because the truth is, every war leaves behind not just ruins, but people trying to live among them. And in that living, small miracles happen. A bottle of shampoo, a shared laugh, a remembered face. These are the threads with which the world begins to weave itself back together. They woke to the hollow clang of the metal bell, the sound slicing through the damp gray dawn like the echo of a memory that refused to die. The air smelled of rust, boiled grain, and the faint sweetness of wet hay that clung to the earth after another cold night. The women rose from their bunks slowly, their movements mechanical, their bodies trained by repetition and resignation. They no longer asked what day it was. Days had lost their shape here, folding into each other like cards in a forgotten deck. The camp sat on the edge of a forgotten field, ringed by barbed wire and guarded by towers that scraped the low sky. Somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the mud and the watchful eyes, the world was moving again. Cars rumbling over cobblestones, people laughing in cafes, music returning to cities that had forgotten sound. But here, in the silence of captivity, time stood still. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with breath and unspoken thoughts. Helga sat at the edge of her cot, tying the same worn scarf around her head, its pattern faded into anonymity. Beside her, Marta folded her blanket precisely, a gesture she had carried from her life before, when precision meant pride rather than survival. Each woman had a ritual that kept her tethered to something human. Some brushed their hair even when it was brittle and dull. Others whispered prayers or simply stared out the window until the sky changed color. The silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that could not be said. They had arrived months ago, transported in trucks that reeked of fuel and defeat. Their hands clutched around the remnants of their past lives. Photographs, lockets, a folded letter that smelled faintly of perfume. When they crossed into the camp, those things were taken from them, as though memory itself could be confiscated. They became numbers, uniforms, silhouettes moving through fog. In the early weeks, they resisted the rhythm of captivity, whispering to each other through cracks in the wall, humming lullabies to the rhythm of the rain. But gradually, the silence grew thicker, filling the space between them like a fog they could not disperse. The guards were not cruel in the way the stories said they would be. They were distant, professional, almost weary. The Americans had taken over the camp from the Germans who had once ruled it, and the irony of the reversal hung in the air like static. The women had been nurses, translators, auxiliaries, some guilty by association, others by accident. To the Americans they were simply prisoners, though not enemies anymore. Their crimes were blurred by politics, their sentences undefined by law. They lived in limbo, neither condemned nor forgiven. Helga often thought about the sound of glass breaking, the night her town fell silent except for the shattering of windows and the low hum of surrender. She could still see the glow of fires reflected in puddles, could still smell the acrid sting of smoke and wet earth. Now, when she washed her face each morning with cold water from a tin basin, she imagined she was washing away that night, though it clung to her skin as stubbornly as the scent of the soap. The soap was harsh, gray and odorless, leaving her hands raw. Sometimes she would rub them until they turned red, as though color could replace memory. The women were given work, mending uniforms, cleaning, cataloging supplies, and though it numbed their bodies, it gave their minds no rest. At night, they dreamed of freedom and woke to the same ceiling. Outside, the guards smoked and talked in low voices. They spoke of home, of baseball, of sweethearts waiting back in places with names that sounded almost imaginary: Ohio, Kansas, Brooklyn. The women listened through cracks in the wall, catching fragments of a world that seemed as distant as the moon. Sometimes the guards would leave old magazines behind, pages torn or faded. The women passed them around like relics, staring at the glossy images of smiling women with shining hair, their laughter frozen in print. For a moment, the camp would go silent, not out of despair but reverence, for beauty, for memory, for the ghost of something once ordinary. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Snow came early that year, soft and relentless, blanketing the barbed wire and turning the camp into something almost peaceful. When it melted, it left behind puddles that reflected the sky, small, perfect mirrors of the world they could not reach. Helga often knelt beside one, dipping her fingers into the reflection, pretending it was a lake. Marta laughed at her, gently. She said, "If you stare long enough, you'll drown in it." But Helga only smiled. "At least I drown in something clean." Clean. That word had become a kind of prayer. Their hair was brittle from the cold, their skin dry, their clothes heavy with dust. There were moments when they would trade stories of their mother's perfumes, of warm baths, of summer rain. And though the memories were tender, they hurt like fresh wounds. The camp doctor, a young American with kind eyes, sometimes brought them small comforts: soap, aspirin, once even a comb. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with a gentleness that made them ache. He reminded them that the war was over, but the women knew that for them, the war had simply changed shape. Peace was just another kind of captivity. And so they waited. They waited through rain and frost, through the long silence of nights broken only by the sound of breathing. They waited without knowing what they were waiting for: a verdict, a release, a word from home. In that waiting, the silence grew alive. It filled the barracks like mist, curling around their dreams, seeping into their bones. It became a part of them, a language without words. Sometimes one of them would hum softly in her sleep, a tune that no one recognized but everyone felt. It was the sound of longing, of a past too heavy to carry and a future too far to imagine. And in that sound, in that fragile thread of music trembling against the cold, there was something that even the silence could not hold captive. The first rumor came like a gust of wind through the cracks of the barracks,
carrying with it a strange energy that unsettled the still air. Someone had overheard one of the guards speaking near the gate. New supplies were coming, American supplies. The word spread from bunk to bunk like sparks in dry grass. Supplies meant change, and change, no matter how small, meant hope. The women pretended not to care at first, keeping their faces still, their hands steady as they scrubbed or stitched, but beneath the surface, curiosity stirred like a heartbeat. For weeks they had lived on the same routine: ration bread, thin soup, gray soap, and silence. But now there was talk of color, of scent, of something different. Even Marta, who had long stopped believing in good news, caught herself glancing toward the gates whenever footsteps echoed across the yard. The guards themselves seemed lighter these days. They spoke in quicker tones, with laughter that carried through the cold morning air. Their accents, New York, Chicago, Texas, rolled through the camp like a foreign melody. The women listened carefully, learning English words the way children catch songs. They didn't understand much, but they understood the rhythm, the warmth, the ease of speech that did not come from fear. It was strange to think of them as human, these men in foreign uniforms who carried the smell of tobacco and soap, who wrote letters home with quiet affection in their eyes. The Americans were not like the soldiers they had known. They smiled easily, offered cigarettes without suspicion, sometimes even shared food. They were young, most of them, barely older than the women they guarded. One of them, a red-haired man named Corporal Davis, often lingered near the kitchen, pretending to check the logs while sneaking glances at Helga as she peeled potatoes. He would nod politely, sometimes say "good morning" in his thick accent, and though she never replied, something in his tone softened her. In the evenings when the lights dimmed and the camp settled into its uneasy quiet, the women spoke in hushed tones about the Americans. They whispered of kindness, of music they might bring, of things they had only read about in the old magazines, the smell of perfume, the taste of chocolate, the luxury of color in a world gone gray. Helga listened but said nothing. She had learned to guard her heart as carefully as her hunger. Hope was dangerous here. It could make the silence unbearable if it failed. Still, she could not stop imagining what American hands might bring into this place: softness, scent, maybe even laughter. One morning, when the mist still clung to the wire fences, a truck rolled into the camp. Its engine growled, heavy with supplies, and the guards moved quickly to unload the crates. The women pressed their faces to the windows, their breath fogging the glass, trying to catch a glimpse. Boxes marked with English words were carried toward the storeroom. Some women claimed they saw tins of butter. Others swore they smelled coffee. Marta whispered, "It could be food, maybe clothes." Helga shook her head. "It's never what we imagine." But even as she said it, she felt something shift inside her, like the first crack in a long winter's ice. Later that day, Davis stopped by the kitchen again. He handed a small packet to the cook and said something that made the man laugh. The packet was bright yellow, with words in blue. Helga couldn't read it from where she stood, but the sight of color alone was enough to make her pause. When Davis caught her looking, he gave a small, almost secret smile before walking away. That night, the whispers grew louder. "Did you see the boxes?" one woman said. "They said, 'care package.' Maybe it's from the Red Cross." "No," another replied. "It's American. I heard one of the guards say it's something special, for hygiene." The word itself felt foreign on their tongues. Hygiene. To be clean again was a luxury too grand to believe in. For months they had washed with gray soap that smelled of nothing, left their hair uncombed, their nails broken. They had forgotten what it meant to feel presentable, to feel like women. But now there were whispers of bottles, of scents, of something that shimmered with the promise of the world beyond wire. The next day brought confirmation. The commander himself entered the yard, reading from a list. He spoke in his clipped American voice,
announcing a new ration for personal maintenance. The women lined up, the wind biting their faces as boxes were opened before them. Inside lay small, perfect bottles, transparent, with liquid the color of sunlight. The label read, "American Shampoo." The sight was enough to make several women gasp. They passed the bottles down the line carefully, as if handling glass relics from another world. Helga held hers in trembling hands. It was light, fragile, impossibly clean. She uncapped it, and at once a fragrance rose into the air. Sweet, sharp, alive. It smelled of citrus, of freedom, of everything she had forgotten existed. For a moment she could not breathe. Tears came to her eyes before she could stop them. Around her the women began murmuring in disbelief. "It smells like flowers," whispered Marta. "Like home," said another. Even the guards looked on quietly, their usual distance softened by something like empathy. Davis caught Helga's gaze from across the yard, gave the faintest nod, then turned away, before the commander saw. That night the barracks buzzed with quiet wonder. The boxes sat beside each bunk, glowing faintly in the lantern light, like trophies of survival. No one could sleep. They uncapped them again and again just to inhale the scent, to remind themselves it was real. Some spoke of saving it, of using it sparingly. Others couldn't wait until morning. For the first time in months, laughter echoed through the dark. Helga lay awake, holding the bottle close, the fragrance lingering in her hands. In that scent she could see fields of sun, the memory of her mother brushing her hair, the sound of rivers before the war. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt immense, as if the world outside the barbed wire had finally remembered them. She thought of the Americans again, of their easy smiles, their music, their strange generosity. They were conquerors, yes, but not in the way she had been taught to fear. There was something gentler in them, something that carried not punishment, but promise. And in the whisper of that promise, the camp seemed to breathe for the first time in years. The women didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something miraculous. Tomorrow they would discover what it meant to feel alive again, not through freedom or forgiveness, but through the simple act of washing their hair with a fragrance from another world. For now they only listened, to the soft hum of wind against the barracks, to the faint rustle of dreams awakening beneath their silence, to the whisper that carried through the night. The Americans had brought something beautiful. Morning came wrapped in a thin veil of fog, softening the hard edges of the camp until everything looked like a faded photograph. The women stirred from their bunks before the bell, driven not by duty this time, but by something unfamiliar, anticipation. In every corner of the barracks there was movement, whispers, quiet laughter, the rustle of fabric. The small glass bottles sat like treasures on each bedside table, glinting faintly in the weak morning light. For months the mornings had been gray, soundless, mechanical, but now the air itself seemed charged with a nervous joy. Helga woke slowly, holding the bottle to her chest. The scent still lingered from the night before, and even before she opened her eyes she could smell it, citrus and warmth, and the strange sweetness of hope. Around her the others were awake too. Marta was already sitting up, her blanket folded neatly beside her, fingers tracing the label on her own bottle as if memorizing every letter. No one wanted to be the first to use it. It felt almost sacrilegious, as if the moment they poured it out, the magic might disappear. But when the guards called them for morning wash, a wave of excitement broke through their hesitation. The washroom, usually a place of silence and drudgery, filled with low chatter and the clinking of tin basins. Someone began humming softly, a tune from long ago, and another joined in. Steam rose from buckets of warm water, warm for once, and the air felt softer, more forgiving. Helga uncorked her bottle carefully, the small pop sounding almost ceremonial. The fragrance that escaped was like sunlight in liquid form. She poured a few drops into her hand, feeling the slick foreign texture between her fingers. As she massaged it into her hair, a lather bloomed. White, soft, miraculous. For the first time since the war began, the air in the camp filled with the scent of something beautiful. The women gasped, then laughed, their voices mingling with the sound of water splashing, of brushes scraping, of hearts remembering how to feel. The foam clung to their hair, to their fingers, to the edges of the cracked mirrors on the wall, transforming the room into something alive. Helga closed her eyes, and for a moment she wasn't in the camp anymore. She was home, in her mother's kitchen, the windows open to the scent of summer rain. Her mother's hands were gentle as she washed her hair, humming softly in rhythm with the breeze. She could almost hear her mother's voice, low, kind, full of the small comforts that the war had stolen. When she opened her eyes again, tears blurred her reflection, but her face looked different. Not young again, not free, but human. Around her, laughter grew louder. Marta splashed water onto her face and shook her head, her hair sticking to her cheeks. "I'd forgotten how this feels," she said, her voice trembling with both laughter and tears, like being alive. The women nodded, too moved to speak. For so long they had carried silence like a second skin, afraid to feel too much, to want too much. But that morning, emotion flooded through them. Relief, nostalgia, joy, grief, all tangled together in a single unstoppable current. Even the guards outside heard the laughter and looked at one another in surprise. One of them, Davis, paused at the doorway, his usual stoic expression softening. He didn't speak, but when Helga looked up, their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, quiet and unspoken. He gave a small nod before walking away, pretending not to notice the joy that had overtaken the prisoners. By the time the morning sun broke through the mist, the washroom was glowing with the scent of soap and freedom. The women stepped outside with wet hair that shimmered faintly in the light. For the first time they felt the sun on clean skin, the air against hair that smelled of lemon and something faintly floral. It was as if they had been given back a piece of themselves. The bottle, small and unassuming, had become a symbol of transformation, an offering from one world to another. Helga held hers close as she walked back to the barracks, her scalp tingling from the unfamiliar sensation of softness. The other women touched their hair, laughing, marveling at the way it shone. They compared scents, argued playfully over which was sweeter, and for a few precious hours the camp was not a prison, but a place of rebirth. In the kitchen, even the guards could smell the difference. The familiar odor of smoke and boiled grain was replaced by something light and alive. Some of them smiled, others looked uncomfortable, as if the sudden humanity of the prisoners was too much to bear. That afternoon, Helga worked in the storeroom, organizing supplies. Davis came in, carrying a clipboard. He hesitated before speaking, his tone quiet. "You like it?" he asked, nodding towards her hair. Helga froze, unsure whether to answer. But his expression was kind, almost boyish. She nodded once, then murmured, "It smells like freedom." He smiled faintly. "That's American shampoo for you." The words were meant as a joke, but they landed like something deeper. For the first time, Helga realized how strange it must be for him, too, to stand between guilt and mercy, between duty and compassion. She wanted to ask him what freedom smelled like to him, but before she could, another guard entered, and Davis straightened, returning to a formality. That evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp seemed quieter than usual, not with despair, but with peace. The women sat together in small groups, their hair braided and shining, their hands busy mending or shelling beans, their eyes softer than they had been in years. Marta hummed under her breath, the tune carrying through the room like a gentle thread. Helga leaned against the wall, the small bottle beside her, almost empty, but infinitely precious. She realized then that the gift was not just the shampoo, it was what it represented. Kindness without demand, beauty without reason, humanity without condition. That night, she dreamed of rivers, clear, endless rivers under open skies. She dreamed of washing away everything that had been done, everything that had been lost. And when she woke, for the first time in years, the silence felt lighter, like something that could finally be broken. The gift of a bottle had done what no command, no speech, no surrender could. It had reminded them that even in captivity, there could still be grace. By the next morning, the camp had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The women awoke with a strange flutter in their chests, an echo of excitement that felt almost childish. The air itself seemed lighter, carrying traces of perfume and possibility. The bottles of American shampoo had turned into talismans overnight, symbols of hope in glass form. Some women tucked them under their pillows as if afraid they might vanish by dawn. Others clutched them during roll call, unwilling to let go even for a moment. The guards watched all this with quiet curiosity, exchanging glances but saying nothing. Perhaps they understood, in their own way, that something profound was happening inside the fences they patrolled. When the morning bell rang, it was followed not by silence, but by laughter. Someone had begun singing softly in the washroom, and the sound spread like wildfire. Soon a chorus of voices joined in, some shy, others bold, all blending into a melody that cut through the gray monotony like sunlight. Helga stood at the edge of the washroom doorway, her heart pounding. Inside, Marta was already laughing, her hair wrapped in a towel, her sleeves rolled up. "Come on," she called. "If we're prisoners, we might as well be clean ones." Helga hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. Buckets of water were being passed around, and the room was alive with movement. Women stood over basins, scrubbing, rinsing, splashing one another in bursts of mischief that would have been unthinkable only days before. Someone spilled a bit of shampoo into a bucket, and a mountain of foam erupted, filling the air with scent and laughter. The women shrieked with joy, scooping up handfuls of bubbles and tossing them like snow. Helga found herself laughing, a sound she hadn't heard from her own mouth in months. It startled her, but it felt good, like waking from a long, dark dream. The foam clung to her hands, her hair, her face. She closed her eyes and let it slide down her skin, the silky texture a revelation. Around her, the laughter swelled into something uncontrollable, pure and wild. The women began to dance, hesitantly at first, then freely. They twirled in the puddles on the floor, their bare feet slipping and splashing. The air shimmered with soap bubbles and joy. It was absurd, it was forbidden, it was wonderful. Even the guards outside stopped to listen. One of them muttered something about crazy kraut girls, but his voice held no malice. From the barracks window, Davis watched silently, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. He could hear their laughter through the walls, and though he knew he shouldn't linger, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Inside, the women had become a storm of colorless beauty, faces flushed, eyes bright, the kind of beauty born not from adornment, but from freedom rediscovered. They danced with their own reflections in the puddles, in the cracked mirrors, in each other's laughter. Marta spun with her arms outstretched, her hair flying, her voice ringing out in a song Helga hadn't heard since before the war. Others joined her, clapping their hands, stamping their feet, making music with whatever they could. The rhythm of the water became a drumbeat, the splashing a kind of applause. The washroom, once a place of silence and sorrow, had turned into a stage for rebirth. Helga stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed. She felt the years of fear, hunger, and loss slip from her shoulders like an old coat. For a few minutes she was no one's prisoner, no one's victim. She was simply alive. When she laughed again, it was full-throated and real. Marta grabbed her hands and pulled her into the dance. "You see," she shouted over the noise, "we haven't forgotten how to be happy." Helga's eyes filled with tears even as she laughed. Around her, the air shimmered with joy and light and the sweet, intoxicating scent of the shampoo. The women's hair glowed with moisture, their movements became unrestrained, and the sound of their laughter reached even the farthest corners of the camp. Outside, a few guards leaned against the wall, pretending not to listen. One of them, a young man barely 20, whispered, "They sound like angels." Another nodded silently, and for a moment even the war felt far away. When the music of laughter finally began to fade, it wasn't from exhaustion, but from reverence. The women stood together panting, dripping with water and foam, staring at each other as if seeing their true selves for the first time. There was beauty in every face, lines of hardship softened by light, eyes that once looked dead, now burning with life. No one spoke, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of gratitude, of something sacred. Helga reached out and touched Marta's arm. She whispered, "Do you think they'll remember this?" Marta smiled faintly. "Maybe, but we will." They began to clean up, wringing towels, mopping the floor, but even the simplest tasks seemed touched by magic. The scent of the shampoo lingered long after the water had drained, clinging to their hair, their skin, their breath. That afternoon, the camp seemed brighter. The sun caught on the wire fences, turning them into ribbons of light instead of barriers. The guards' boots didn't sound as harsh on the gravel. Even the food, thin soup and bread, tasted somehow less bitter. The laughter from the morning echoed faintly, carried on the wind like a memory that refused to fade. Helga sat outside for a while, the empty bottle beside her. She watched a group of women hanging laundry, their clean hair glinting in the sun. It struck her how strange it was that something as small as soap and scent could bring back dignity, that the simple act of being clean could make them feel human again. Davis passed by, pausing briefly. He said, "It smells like a perfume factory in here." Helga smiled without answering. She didn't need to. The joy on her face spoke for itself. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the camp grew quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet, gentle, content, almost holy. The women lay in their bunks, their hair spread like halos against their pillows, and the fragrance of the shampoo mingled with the cool night air. Somewhere a soft hum began, a song without words, carried from one bunk to another until it filled the room. Helga listened, her heart swelling. She thought of how something so ordinary could become extraordinary in the right moment. The Americans hadn't meant to give them joy. They had meant to give them hygiene, but somehow they had given them life. In the distance, the guards played a record on a portable gramophone, something jazzy, foreign, alive. The rhythm drifted through the fences, merging with the women's song until there was no line between them. For that one night, the camp was not divided by war or wire, but united by the fragile beauty of shared sound. And in that fragile harmony, as the stars blinked awake above the quiet camp, the women dreamed not of freedom or revenge, but of dance, laughter, and the scent of a world that still had beauty left to give. The morning after the dance dawned in silence, but it was a silence unlike any before. It was not the suffocating quiet of despair, but the tender calm that follows release. The camp felt lighter, as though the laughter from the day before had scrubbed the air itself clean. The scent of the American shampoo still hung faintly in the barracks, sweet and citrusy, a whisper of something beautiful that refused to fade. The women moved differently that morning, slower, gentler, their shoulders less burdened by the invisible weight they had carried for so long. It was as if the act of washing away the grime had also washed away a part of their sorrow. Helga sat by the window, running her fingers through her hair. It was soft now, impossibly soft, and it caught the light like threads of gold. She stared at her reflection in the cracked piece of mirror propped against the wall. The mirror had always mocked her before, its fractured surface reflecting a face she barely recognized, a face hardened by hunger and grief. But today, the image that looked back at her seemed almost familiar. Her skin was still pale, her eyes still shadowed, yet there was something different in her expression. She saw not defeat, but endurance. The faintest glimmer of the woman she used to be. Marta joined her, sitting beside her on the bunk, holding her own mirror shard. "You look different," she said softly. Helga smiled. "So do you." Marta laughed quietly, a sound that still felt strange in her own throat. "I can't remember the last time I looked at myself and didn't flinch." She tilted her head, inspecting her reflection with mock vanity. "Maybe I'll start a beauty salon when I get out of here." Helga chuckled, the sound warming the cold morning air. "We'll need customers first." Marta grinned. "Oh, don't worry. After this war, everyone will need some fixing up." Their laughter faded into a comfortable quiet. Around them, the other women were tending to small rituals of care. Brushing hair, mending torn sleeves, scrubbing boots until they shone. They were reclaiming themselves piece by piece through gestures so simple they almost seemed defiant. For years, their lives had been dictated by commands, schedules, and silence. Now, even the smallest act of choice, a brushstroke, a sigh, a smile, felt like rebellion. Helga's gaze lingered on the mirror again. She thought about who she had been before the war, before the uniforms, before the fear. A teacher, a daughter, a woman who believed in order and meaning. That woman had been buried under rubble and years of survival, but now she could feel her stirring again, faint but alive. She touched her face, tracing the lines that hardship had drawn there. "Do you ever think," she asked Marta quietly, "that maybe this is what being human means? Not surviving, not fighting, but remembering how to care about yourself again?" Marta didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, rough and scarred, then nodded slowly. "Maybe. Maybe it's not about forgetting what happened. Maybe it's about not letting it steal what's left." Outside, the guards' voices echoed faintly, mingling with the morning wind. Somewhere, someone was humming. It wasn't a song Helga recognized, but its melody was soft and warm, the kind that made you think of home. She closed her eyes and listened, letting the sound settle in her bones. Later, when the women lined up for work duty, Davis passed by. His eyes met Helga's briefly, and for the first time, he smiled without hesitation. It wasn't a soldier's smile, it was something gentler, more human. She returned it just barely, and that small exchange carried enough warmth to last the entire day. In the storeroom, as she sorted boxes, Helga found a scrap of polished metal that caught her reflection. She studied it absently, thinking of how mirrors had become a kind of test for them. Each time they looked, they asked themselves the same silent question: "Who am I now?" The answers were never simple. Some saw guilt, others saw loss, some saw strength. But today, Helga saw something else: possibility. That night, as the women gathered in the barracks, Marta produced a small shard of broken glass she had polished clean. She set it in the middle of the table. "A real mirror," she said. "Let's see what's left of us." The women leaned in one by one, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light. There were gasps, laughter, even tears. They touched their cheeks, adjusted scarves, ran their fingers through their clean hair. For a moment, the barracks felt like a dressing room before a grand performance. "Look at us," one woman whispered. "We're beautiful." And she was right, not in the way of polished magazines or painted faces, but in the raw, luminous way of people who have survived and still dare to smile. Helga's turn came last. She leaned over the mirror, the reflection wavering in the dim light. Her face looked older than she remembered, but her eyes were bright. She smiled at herself, really smiled, for the first time in years. And in that reflection, she didn't see a prisoner. She saw a woman reborn. The mirror became their secret altar. Every night they would gather around it, taking turns to look, to remember, to reclaim. Some whispered prayers, others jokes. It became their ritual of defiance, a way to remind themselves that even in captivity, they owned something no one could take, the right to see themselves as human. As days passed, the camp guards began to notice the change. The women walked taller, spoke with more confidence. The air of resignation that once hung over them had been replaced by something harder to define: dignity. Even the commander commented on it once, muttering that the Kraut women were acting like they'd won something. He didn't understand that they had. Helga started keeping a small journal, writing on scraps of paper she found in the storeroom. She wrote about the shampoo, the laughter, the mirror, the feeling of her hair against the pillow at night. She wrote because she didn't want to forget. Not the pain, not the joy, not the fragile balance between them. Each word felt like stitching a wound closed. Marta helped others braid their hair in the evenings. She'd say, "It's a small thing, but it keeps the ghosts away." And maybe she was right. The ghosts were still there, the dead, the lost, the guilty, but their whispers grew quieter with each act of care. Sometimes Helga wondered what the Americans thought of them now. Did they see prisoners or women? Did they understand the quiet miracle they had sparked? I doubt it. To them it was just soap. To her it was salvation. One evening, Davis approached her as she carried supplies to the storeroom. He hesitated before speaking. "You look different," he said. She smiled faintly. "Clean, you mean?" He shook his head. "No, alive." The word lingered between them, fragile and electric. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that something as simple as a bottle had changed their world, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she nodded and walked away, her heart beating fast. That night, she wrote one more entry in her hidden journal. "We are beginning to see ourselves again, not as enemies, not as victims, just as women. Maybe that is what being human means. Not the open gate, but the courage to face your reflection and not turn away." In the dim barracks light, the women gathered once more around the mirror. They laughed softly, the sound blending with the steady rhythm of the wind outside. The mirror reflected not perfection but truth, a collage of faces marked by survival, glowing with the fragile light of rebirth. Helga looked into it one last time before blowing out the lantern. "We'll remember," she whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by reflections and ghosts and quiet strength, she knew they would. The days that followed unfolded with an unfamiliar grace. The camp, once a gray island of despair, now moved with the quiet rhythm of something healing. The barbed wire still stood, the guards still paced, the routines remained, yet the air was no longer heavy. It carried the faint sweetness of the American shampoo, a scent that lingered in the women's hair, in their clothes, in the very fabric of their survival. It was as though the fragrance had woven itself into time, marking a before and an after, an invisible line between despair and rebirth. Helga woke earlier now, not from orders or fear, but from habit and hope. Each dawn brought light that seemed softer than before, and she would stand by the window to watch the horizon break open, the sky blushing faintly against the mist. She thought often of the world beyond the wire and wondered if it could smell this clean. Marta joined her most mornings, standing quietly beside her, their silence warm and companionable. They no longer spoke much about the war. It had receded like a bad dream that left its scars, but not its power. The women worked, ate, slept, but beneath every action was a new rhythm, a pulse that whispered of tomorrow. Even the guard seemed changed, Davis especially. He carried himself differently now, less as a warden, more as a man who had seen the weight of what captivity did to souls. He still said little, but when he passed there was a gentleness in his nod that spoke louder than words. One morning, as Helga sorted linens, Davis approached. "You know," he said, awkwardly scratching his neck, "they say this camp's closing soon." The words hung in the air. Helga froze. Closing? Transfers, releases. Some are being sent home. He met her eyes. Maybe you, too. For a moment she could not breathe. Home. The word felt foreign, like a sound from another language she once knew. That night the news spread like wildfire. Some women cried, others laughed. Freedom. It was the word they had dreamed of, but now that it was near, it terrified them. Who were they outside these fences? What world waited beyond? Helga lay awake, her fingers resting on the empty shampoo bottle by her bed. The scent was nearly gone, yet she could still feel it, still remember the moment it had brought life back into her bones. It had given them more than cleanliness, it had given them identity. And now, as they stood on the edge of something new, that memory became their compass. The morning of departure came wrapped in frost. The sky was a pale, endless blue. The women lined up quietly, their faces solemn, yet radiant. They carried bundles of their few belongings, scarves, journals, scraps of memory, and for many those precious empty bottles. The guards checked lists, stamped papers, nodded. Davis stood near the gate, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. When Helga's name was called, she stepped forward, her knees weak. He looked at her once more and said softly, "Take care, Helga." She hesitated, then whispered, "Thank you for seeing us." He nodded, unable to answer. Then she stepped through the gate. Beyond the wire, the road stretched toward a world that felt impossibly wide. Each step felt heavier than she expected. Freedom was not weightless, it was full of ghosts. But as she walked, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest trace of citrus and soap. It was the scent of their laughter, their courage, their defiance. It followed them out as if to promise that even beyond the fences, the memory of joy would endure. They reached a small village by midday. Life was returning there, children chasing each other through the mud, women hanging laundry, men rebuilding walls. The smell of bread and wood smoke filled the air. A woman offered them water, and Helga drank deeply, the taste sharp and clear. It felt like baptism. That night they slept in an old schoolhouse. The floors creaked. The walls bore the scars of war, but the warmth of blankets and human kindness made it feel like paradise. Marta turned to Helga and whispered, "Do you think we'll forget?" Helga shook her head. "No, and we shouldn't. Some memories are meant to be carried." Years later, the world would move on. Cities rebuilt, lives resumed, and history wrote itself in tidy lines. But Helga never forgot the camp, or the shampoo, or the laughter that had saved them. On her windowsill, she kept the small, empty bottle. The glass had turned cloudy with age, the label faded, yet she could still remember its scent. Clean, bright, full of promise. When visitors asked about it, she would smile and say, "That was the day I remembered I was alive." Sometimes she dreamed of Davis standing at the gate, sunlight catching his hair, and in her dreams they said what they never could in words, that kindness was a kind of victory too. As the years passed, Helga grew old, her hair turning silver, but every morning she still washed it carefully, still inhaled deeply as if to catch the faint echo of that scent. To her, it was not about the bottle. It was about what it represented: hope, dignity, rebirth. When she spoke to her grandchildren, she told them not of battles or politics, but of that one day in the camp when women danced with joy because of a gift they did not expect. The children laughed, and she laughed with them, her eyes shining. She would say, "Remember, beauty can survive anything, even war." On her final morning, Helga sat by the window, watching the dawn spill across the fields. The air was cool, the world quiet. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, and for a fleeting moment she could swear she smelled it again. The scent of shampoo, of laughter, of freedom. It was the scent of tomorrow, and she smiled as the light filled the room, knowing she had carried it with her all along.